triggers are the things that we trip over that take us to the trauma responses. It can be a word. It can be a phrase. It can be a reaction by somebody else. It can be a situation that you find yourself in. So if I'm trying to think of myself specifically and some of my triggers, for me, for instance, I have abandonment trauma. So one of my triggers might be waking up in the morning and finding that my partner has left the house and hasn't told me that they're not going to be there and hasn't left a note. So if I wake up and the house is empty, that's a trigger for me.
Welcome to the You Are Not Your Trauma podcast, a show that reminds you that you are not alone, your experiences matter, and you are not defined by what you've been through. Each week, you will hear from the host and invited guests who have either personal or professional experience with trauma. They will share their stories and strategies for overcoming past wounds and beginning the journey toward healing and wholeness. Now, here's your host, a gifted speaker, author, coach, and entrepreneur, Harriet M. Harris.
Hello, and welcome to a brand new episode of You Are Not Your Trauma, the podcast that brings hope, healing, and inspiration to those who have experienced life's most challenging moments. I'm your host, Harriet M. Harris, and I am so glad that you're here today. I hope that this show is an important part of your healing journey. Now, in this episode, we will get into the nitty-gritty of what triggers and trauma responses are, how to recognize them, and most importantly, what you can do about them. We'll be discussing practical tips, emotional cues, and cognitive techniques to help you navigate this often challenging yet crucial aspect of the healing process. To guide us through this topic, I'm honored to have with us a trauma-conscious transformational master coach and shamanic healer who has herself walked the difficult path of trauma recovery, Faith Koltak. In addition to being a coach and healer, Faith also speaks to audiences about healing trauma, overcoming adversity, rewiring neurology, and creating a life that is big enough for you. So welcome, Faith. Thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
It's wonderful to be here.
Now, Faith, will you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit more detailed about what you do?
Yes. So I am a trauma-conscious transformational master coach. I switched careers in the middle of my life. I used to work in finance and operations, and it wasn't fulfilling. I come from a background of trauma. I come from significant childhood trauma myself, and needed to heal my own trauma. But more than that, I needed to be doing something that was making a difference in this world. And working in finance and operations, I mean, it did, but not in a way that was meaningful. And the work that I'm doing today is meaningful. It changes people's lives and in a way that makes a difference for how they can show up in this world. And I needed that. My soul needed that. My heart needed that. I'm able to go home from work every day and feel like I'm doing something that is making a real impact on people's lives. And that was important to me.
Well, I commend you wholeheartedly for making the shift to doing what your soul needed in your life. So congratulations to that. And I'm sure there are so many people that are benefiting from that shift that you made. So congratulations to that. So I would like for you to begin just by telling us or helping our listeners to understand what triggers and trauma responses are for those that may not be aware?
So triggers are the things that we trip over that take us to the trauma responses. It can be a word, it can be a phrase, it can be a reaction by somebody else. It can be a situation that you find yourself in. So if I'm trying to think of myself specifically and some of my triggers, for me, for instance, I have abandonment trauma. So one of my triggers might be waking up in the morning and finding that my partner has left the house and hasn't told me that they're not going to be there and hasn't left a note. So if I wake up and the house is empty, that's a trigger for me. And then my trauma response to that is to go into this place where I am concerned that they've left me. Like I automatically go into that. Where have they gone? Why have they gone? Why didn't they let me know that they were leaving? That fear that they left me. Right. Because they tripped that trigger, or that trigger was tripped rather. So the trigger is the thing that takes you into the trauma response. That thing that causes your unconscious mind to say, this is so similar to what happened in the past. It may be a word that somebody uses that your parent used before physical abuse started. It may be a situation that occurs that is reminiscent of what happened if you were sexually abused as a child, or even as an adult. If there was sexual abuse as an adult, it may be the way somebody touches you, or the way somebody leans in as a kiss, or for a kiss, that reminds you of sexual trauma that you've experienced in your life, that causes you to respond in a way, maybe puts you into fight or flight mode, maybe causes you to tense up. That's your trauma response. That's that thing that says, oh no, this situation is familiar to a situation that I experienced in the past where I did experience trauma. But the trigger is what takes us back to that situation in the past that says this is similar to what happened there, and causes us to go into that trauma response.
Wow. Thank you. Because I felt like that a lot of times we experience things and we don't have a name for them. So I thought it was very important for us to get that out kind of in the beginning, so that our listeners would really understand when we are talking about triggers and trauma response, exactly what you mean. So thank you so much for that. Now we're going to take a very quick commercial break, and we'll get right back so that we can really get into this conversation with Faith. So we will be right back.
Want a chance to win exclusive You Are Not Your Trauma merch? Here's how. Leave a rating and a review on your favorite podcast platform and share your thoughts with us. It helps us reach more listeners who may also be seeking healing and growth. Once you left your feedback, visit feedback.youarenotyourtrauma.com to let us know you've entered by entering your info and the word feedback in the message section. You could be a lucky winner. Now stay tuned for today's inspiring episode, and thank you for being a part of the You Are Not Your Trauma community.
Okay, we are back. Now, Faith, you mentioned at the very beginning that you had experienced some childhood trauma. Would you mind sharing with our audience, just as much as you feel like sharing, just a bit about your experience with trauma?
Of course. So I have significant trauma. I spoke earlier that I have abandonment is some of my trauma. And that came in a couple of forms. When I was 9 years old, I woke up one morning and my mother had just left overnight. She had apparently had a bag packed in the basement for months. And so nobody was looking for those clothes that had been in that bag, and nobody was looking for the purse that she took with her. And she just disappeared, and we didn't hear from her. It was about 2 weeks before the end of the school year. We didn't hear from her until about a week before the next school year started. So for the entire summer, we had no idea where she was. I was one of 4 children. We had no idea where she had gone. We didn't know if she had left of her own free will, or if there was somebody else involved in that, if there was any foul play involved in that. We had no idea if she was dead or alive for that entire summer. And I mean, so prior to me being 9 years old, there was significant emotional abuse. There was significant neglect. I was, by the time I was 7 years old, I was the person who was fully responsible for making sure that my siblings, even my older brother, making sure that they had clean clothes, making sure that they had food, making sure that the house was clean. Like, I was essentially the mom by the time I was 7 years old. So there was significant neglect in the house prior to that. There was alcoholism in the house prior to that. There was physical abuse in the house prior to that. So there was already significant trauma prior to that. And then there was the abandonment. While she was gone, her husband at the time, part of the reason that she left is because he had substance abuse issues. He was an alcoholic and addicted to, there were several drugs that he used that summer that I saw. He offered pot to my older brother. So if I was 9, my older brother was 11. He let my younger brother smoke pot. My younger brother would have been 6. He offered it to my younger sister, who would have been 4 or 5 at the time. He didn't offer it to me, interestingly. I saw him with it. He asked me if I knew what it was, but he never offered it to me. But there was sexual abuse. He told me that it was my job to be the woman of the house with my mom gone. So my mother had custody of my older brother and I, and we visited my father every other weekend. And so we were only there for 2 weeks. And when we went to visit my dad, I stayed for the rest of the summer and didn't go back. And then when my mom returned, I was the one who was accused of having abandoned the other children and her husband, because I spent the summer with my father. I was the one who had abandoned them. So 2 years later, I moved in with my dad, and then my mother abandoned me again. She didn't speak to me for a year because I did that. In the meanwhile, so from the time I was about 7 until I moved in with my father, if I was allowed out of the house, I wasn't allowed off the front porch. So I had no social life. There were no sleepovers. I wasn't allowed to talk on the telephone. I wasn't allowed to go to the mall or to the roller rink. I wasn't allowed to go to school dances. I wasn't things that children typically were allowed to do. I wasn't allowed to do. And we lived in significant poverty. We lived on a street that was 3 blocks long and had 7 crack houses by the time I moved in with my dad. So there was poverty, there was food scarcity, there was it was a tough childhood. And it led into a tough adulthood. There was abuse in my adulthood as well. There was physical abuse and sexual trauma and all of that, because abuse begets abuse. Until you heal it, you will continue in that cycle. And I did.
So true.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm very sorry for the things that you experienced, Faith. But I do appreciate you sharing, being vulnerable and sharing it with our audience. So can you kind of talk to us about how you realized that that there were things that were triggering for you that would take you back into those spaces? Because I think a lot of times, sometimes our lives become normal, like the cycle of what we do, it becomes just so normal that it feels like what we're living is the way we're supposed to be living. But then at some point we find out, oh no, there's a name for that. This is a thing. This is something that can change. This is something that can be healed. When did you have that moment, or that time period in your life where you were realizing that there was a trigger, there were trauma, there were trauma responses that were kind of keeping you in a cycle?
I did not have that realization until I was well into my 40s.
Mm.
I honestly believed that I had dealt with my trauma. And for me, dealing with my trauma really had been suppressing it. It had been not dealing with it.
Yeah.
I thought I was dealing with it, and I was really just not dealing with it. I had acknowledged it and then pretended that I was okay, that I had moved on. And you don't move on from trauma. It doesn't go away. You can pretend that it doesn't exist. And here's the thing that I try to tell people, that I really want people to understand is, you can decide when you are going to heal your trauma, when you are going to deal with it, when you are going to face it, and how you are going to do that. Or your trauma will decide when you are going to deal with your trauma. And it is going to blow up in a really magnificent, really ugly way. And the timing is not going to be yours. And there are going to be consequences that you are not going to be prepared for. But you have to know that the chances of you getting through this life without facing it, without dealing with it, without looking at it, the chances of that happening are so very small. So I got into my 40s without dealing with it. And I made a bunch of life changes. I decided that I wasn't going to work that job that was destroying my soul. I got out of a marriage in which I was not happy. And in doing that, I had to acknowledge the fact that I had become an alcoholic, because I was married to an alcoholic. And I was a coach, and I began my training specific to trauma, because I was starting to acknowledge my own traumas, but I had no idea how deeply they ran. I had no idea like exactly what I was going to have to face. And then realized that I was facing it without alcohol. I had been self-medicating with alcohol for a decade. Wow. And so I made all of these life choices, all of these life changes, and started dealing with my trauma. And I was doing it without alcohol. And I went down a really deep hole, and I became suicidal. And this work that I do, the trauma work that I do, is literally what saved my life. Like, I am a walking billboard for the work that I do, because it literally saved my life. And so that was when I really started to understand how deep those wounds ran, how many there were, how much they overlap, how many layers they have to them. Like, you will heal one layer of that trauma, and then something's going to bring it up again, and you'll think, I thought I dealt with this. I thought I healed this. And then you think you failed. Then you think you did something wrong because you thought you dealt with it. And you have to understand that you're not healing the same thing. You're not healing the same. You're healing a different layer of that trauma. You didn't do anything wrong. You didn't fail in any way. This is a different, you healed that deeper level. And now this is a more superficial layer of it. And there are tendrils that come out that you don't realize, like you're not healing that same exact wound. This is just a connection to that wound that you didn't realize existed. And there are so many of them, especially when you're talking about those big T traumas, right? When you're talking about the sexual abuse and the really severe physical abuse and the really severe abandonment issues. There are so many layers and so many tendrils that you have to deal with. And you have to give yourself grace, and you have to understand that it doesn't happen overnight. No, it took you years to get to that point that you're ready to address it and ready to heal it. And you have to allow yourself time for the healing process. And you have to allow those levels to come to the surface, those layers to come to the surface to be healed. You just have to give yourself that grace.
That is so true. You said a couple of things. I kind of smiled when you were talking about, dealing with your trauma. We don't get through life without having to face it. And one of the things that I often say is you have to deal with your trauma, or your trauma is going to deal with you.
Yes.
So that's something that I learned in my own way. But the other thing, and I find that these chats, these interviews, these, the podcast sessions are all so interesting, because I learn how connected we all are in that we experience so many similar things in so many ways. You feel like it's just you're kind of by yourself. But when you said, you thought you healed, but you actually had suppressed it, that was such a familiar, just hearing you say that, it was so familiar, because I too was in my 40s when I really got the real deal, gotta heal thing versus, like, oh yeah, I acknowledged it. I'm just gonna forgive the folks so I can move forward, because, I just want to let it go. And it just doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. So I'm so glad that you shared that that part of your experience, because I think it's so important for our listeners to really begin to understand that.
Right. And forgiveness is an important part of the process, but I think it's really important to clarify that forgiveness is for you and not for them. And forgiveness is not justification, and it is not absolution, and it does not say that they were not wrong, and it does not say that it does not say that you were wrong. It doesn't mean that you own any responsibility. It does not mean that they are abdicated of any of their responsibility. Forgiveness just says that you don't have to carry the weight of this any longer, that you can put it down here, and you can leave this person. You can leave any relationship, any responsibility you feel toward any kind of relationship with this person right here. You don't have to carry that forward with you any longer. That's all forgiveness is.
Absolutely.
It's for you. It's not for them.
And what I think found the most difficult was the fact that I call myself, I'll say, doing the work to forgive them, but I left out forgiving me.
Yes.
And that was when the real healing began for me.
Oh, and can we talk about that for a moment?
Absolutely.
Because that, as trauma survivors, so often we believe that we are somehow responsible. If I had said something, if I had screamed, if I hadn't warned that, if I hadn't said that, if I hadn't provoked them, if I hadn't been there, if I hadn't, and we carry this responsibility as though we are somehow culpable, like it's our fault
Right.
that this happened to us. And
It's not.
if you are listening to this and you are carrying that and you believe that it is your fault, I need you to hear me tell you that it is not your fault. It is not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. You do not own responsibility. And now is the time for you to forgive yourself.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. The self-blame, it is a heavy weight
Yes.
that we carry. And until we realize that it's okay to let it go, until we realize that
it was never yours to
forgiving
carry
us,
in the first place.
Never ours to carry.
Right. Yeah.
Very true. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for that reminder and that message to our listeners, because it
so
is
important.
something that is very, very, very important for us to realize. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yes.
So Faith, what would you say is the first step in recognizing triggers and understanding trauma responses, especially for those, who may not be aware that they're being triggered?
So that's the biggest thing, right? Is learning that self-awareness, really. And it is a process. The first step, honestly, is being willing to invest in yourself. You're not going to learn this on your own.
Yes.
So you have to allow yourself to understand that your mental health is not a luxury. Your mental health is a necessity. And it is important for you to invest in yourself, whether you work with a coach who has trauma training, specific trauma training. Just because they say that they are a coach who deals with trauma does not mean that they are trained to deal with trauma.
Right.
Or a counselor or a therapist or a clergy member or whoever it is that you opt to work with. It is an investment in yourself and in your future. And you need to be willing to make that investment, because the self-awareness that you need to have in order to recognize your triggers is not likely to be something that you are going to gain on your own. You have got to get through the limiting beliefs that you have about yourself.
Yes.
You have to learn to pause in your reactions. And often when we come from trauma, those reactions are so immediate that it's difficult for us to find that pause in the reactions, to think about where those reactions are coming from and why we are reacting in that way. We don't recognize often that they're triggers. We don't, and even if somebody points them out to us, we're going to argue that that's not what's happening.
Yes. That is, I remember someone once telling me, you have anger issues. And I was like, what? What do you mean I have anger issues?
I'm not angry.
Oh yeah, it was ugly. And the truth of the matter was I did have anger issues. It took me some therapy and, a lot of therapy, I'll say, to realize that, but it was true. And I often think back to that conversation and just how wrong I was, because, my guard was up. I was offended. I was, in defense mode. I was ready to, argue the truth of the matter is I could see red spots and fire in my eyes when I got, angry, and it was uncontrollable. And it wasn't until
you were in survival mode.
Absolutely.
You were still in survival mode. And that's the thing. Most of us often are still in survival mode. And we have to give ourselves permission to come out of survival mode before we can gain the self-awareness we have to change these behaviors. And a lot of times we don't recognize that we are still living in survival mode 10 years later, or 20 years later, or 40 years later.
Very, very, very true.
If that's all you know, that's all you do.
Yep. Yep. And that is true. So I can completely agree with, a lot of times we do not know how to recognize the triggers, but I think great advice is getting someone that can lead and guide you to it, because another human or even myself could not have, that wasn't a therapist, I'll say, in my case, that wasn't a professional. I don't think another person could have guided me to that. Definitely not the person that told me I had anger issues. Like, they were not getting anywhere with me. And
Right.
I don't think I could have heard it or seen it any other way.
Right. And so for me, even with my training,
Mm-hmm.
I still now I understand my triggers, but I
Mm-hmm.
still now will stumble over a trauma response that I'm just now identifying and just now mapping back to something. And it is only because of my training that I'm able to do that for myself. I shouldn't say it's only because of my training. It's because of my training and the self-awareness that I have as a result of my training and the work that I have done. But there's a lot of self-awareness and there's a lot of work that I have done as the result of that. And it's years later,
Right.
and I'm still identifying trauma responses and mapping that back to the trauma, in part because the trauma was so significant. But I say that, and I stand up on every platform that I have, and am very vulnerable with how I show up, because I want people to understand that they're not alone. And that even those of us who work in the industry, even those of us who work in mental health, like, we're still not perfect.
Right.
We still struggle with these same things. We still get it wrong sometimes. We
Absolutely.
still find these things about ourselves years later. And so often our clients feel like they're failing if they don't get it perfect right away. And I try to make it very clear, like, you're not failing. You're doing the same thing the rest of us do. We do the same things, even though that we are professionals in this field. We do the very same things. Even with all of my knowledge and all of my training and all of my self-awareness, I still am finding things.
Yeah, I think it's something that's ongoing. I know I often have to kind of, like you mentioned, that pause. There's not always a time that I pause. I actually would jump straight to anger. The pause is not there. But I have found, now that I am able to take that pause and just really assess, okay, what is really happening here? And what is pushing me to this point. So I think you're right. It is an ongoing thing. And another thing you mentioned is the importance of getting through those limiting beliefs.
Yes.
Now, I could do an entire episode on that, but in the time that we have, that was something that I would say that I had to learn was a thing that was keeping me from it was sabotaging me. I'll say that. It was sabotaging me, because those limiting beliefs were doing exactly what it says. They were limiting me. They were causing me to not feel good about myself. And it was all because of those thoughts that were just created, those feelings of abandonment, of those feelings of embarrassment, those feelings of anger, just all of those feelings. And then it just kind of gets stuck with you. So I really appreciate that point.
Yeah. So a lot of the work that I do specifically is around those limiting beliefs. I don't do talk therapy the way a lot of therapists do. And the work that I do is more intense in a lot of ways, and it's also done in a much shorter duration. So my clients come in and they work with me for 8 to 12 weeks typically. And the sessions might be 2 to 3 hour sessions once a week for those 8 to 12 weeks. But then they are pretty much done and they have the tools. They may come back and they may choose to work with me for a longer period of time, and they may come back after 6 months and say, hey, Faith, I've hit this. Can we work together for another month or two? But they really have the tools. And it is because we deal with the limiting beliefs that they pick up in trauma. What you really need to heal from trauma is what you internalize from the trauma. So it is the, I am not worthy, I am not good enough, I don't deserve. It is those things that we internalize and carry with us. And then we tell ourselves these stories throughout our lives. And that is why we get into these patterns of unhealthy behavior, because I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I don't deserve any better. And we stay in these unhealthy patterns because of that. That is the real trauma. I mean, obviously there's pain that comes from everything else, but that is what we end up really carrying with us, are those limiting beliefs that we pick up as a result of what happened to us. And that's what we have to excise.
I completely agree. I actually, as I experienced that in my healing, I actually wrote a book that's called Stop Stopping Your Success, which focuses on working through those limiting beliefs, really helping you to understand what they are, where they come from, but also helping you to kind of deep dive into, is it true? Is it real? And then creating what I call your new empowering truths. So that was a huge revelation for me in my healing journey, was to understand that all those things that I've been telling myself, the lack, the scarcity, all of those things that, you know, I couldn't have this, or wasn't deserving of something. And the truth of the matter is, you know, God created us for greatness, and he promised us abundance. And if I'm talking against that, then I am talking against what he has already laid out for me, and that is just not cool. So
right. And yes, and the other important thing to tie in for those people who are struggling with money and cycles of debt, how you do money is how you do other things in life. So if you're telling yourself, I'm not worthy and I don't deserve, worth and deserve tie into money. So look at your finances and look at the limiting beliefs you have in other areas of your life, and let's talk about whether these things overlap and whether those limiting beliefs are affecting your money and the cycles that you have with money as a result.
That is wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I'm actually writing that down. Because that's a very good point.
Yeah. And
how you do money is how you do other things in life.
It is. Yeah. And there's a program that a fellow coach and I put together, my Money Magicians program, and that's what we dive into. We talk about the limiting beliefs that you have, the money story that you have created about yourself, and we work on getting rid of those limiting beliefs and writing a new money story for yourself.
Nice. Okay. So, Faith, can you tell me, are there common misconceptions about triggers and trauma responses that you encounter in your work?
So I think that I think that there are a ton of common misconceptions when you talk about triggers. I think that people tend to think that they're really basic. They don't understand how deep they run. I think that there's a misconception that once you've identified it, that it's really easy to just deal with it and heal it and make it go away. And that's not true. That trigger is so deeply embedded often. There's a reason that it's a trigger, you know, and there's a reason that triggers can provoke such an intense trauma response from us. And we're talking trauma response. I mean, think about the words that we're using. You know, it's not just an emotional response. Trauma that's a big word, and we need to be very careful as we're thinking about the words that we use. I think that that's the other thing. and it's one of my pet peeves. We throw around the word trauma. We throw around PTSD. We talk about having PTSD from pretty kind of minor incidents in our life. This thing happened and I have PTSD from it. PTSD is a mental health diagnosis.
Yeah.
And it is big. Trauma is the result of a significant event that leaves an impact on us, that scars us emotionally and mentally. So I just warn people to be mindful of the words that we're using and to not use big words for small events, because it diminishes the meaning.
Yes.
When we're using them for large events. It diminishes PTSD for people who have a mental health diagnosis of PTSD. Right. It diminishes trauma for people who are dealing with trauma. If you're talking about a trauma response to, slamming your finger in the car or something, yeah, it can be traumatic. There can be a trauma response, but you don't necessarily truly have a trauma response. And so then when somebody else talks about the trauma response that they have to being sexually abused repeatedly for 10 years, you're potentially diminishing the words that they're using. And so I would warn people to be careful about that. I think one of the biggest misconceptions, though, is that once that's identified, that it's really easy to heal that. And they are just so deeply rooted. And we need to be mindful of that. And we need to understand that it's called trauma for a reason. And it takes a long time often, even with trauma work, even when you're aware of it, even when you're on top of it, even when you're pausing, it can still take a long time to really fully undo patterns of behavior, to consciously remove those behaviors from patterns that you engage in can be a process. So again, it doesn't happen overnight, even when you're working at it. And I think that that's a misconception that people have. I think that, that's probably the biggest thing that I run into is people, I think they want it to be easy. I think we want it to be easy, right?
We do. I mean, because as you're saying this, I can think about my own experience, because I went to therapy 10 years ago to work through my trauma. And I thought I was done until, I don't know, maybe it was not 10, it was like 13 years ago. And, I was like, okay, I learned this. And it was almost like checking off a box. I learned this and I learned that and I understand this. And, I understand that now. But the truth of the matter is there is still something on the inside that had not been healed, like it hadn't been fixed. And not that it'll ever just really get healed, because that's a journey. It's something that's ongoing. But I didn't understand that at that time. I thought that I just needed to go. I need to talk to somebody. I need to get it out. I need to, say what I want to say, get mad, be angry, have my emotions. And then I needed to stop the dreams, stop the memories. I needed to get, all of that done so that I could just move on with my life. I needed to forgive, all these things that you see and read about. And I thought that was it. So I do understand what you mean when you say, we want it to happen fast. Guilty. Like I did. I wanted it to be over. But the truth of the matter is it's never over. It's something that you have to continuously process and just learn to process it a little bit better each day.
Right. It's kind of like having a really badly broken femur, and maybe you have to have surgery to have that repaired. And it takes a while for that to heal. and you really have to tend to it well, to pay attention to it. You have to kind of baby it. You can't walk on it, and it gradually gets better, and you can do these things and put more weight on it, and then you can walk on it, but you're still kind of favoring it a bit. And then you can put your full weight on it, but you're just really ginger with it, and that scar is still really fresh, and eventually the scar fades, and later it fades a little bit more. That scar doesn't ever really go away, and that bone is always a little more fragile than, I mean, maybe there's a rod or a screw or something in your bone to give it more support, but that bone is always a little more fragile than your other femur is.
Yeah.
Because it was broken, because it has that wound, and we have to allow our trauma to be that too. There's always that part of us is always going to be a little more fragile, and that scar is always going to be there. It doesn't ever go away. You can't outrun it. It doesn't disappear from your life. You don't forget. You don't ever forget that it happened to you.
Nope.
It's always going to be there. The question is, how do we carry it? How do we respond to the rest of our lives? How do we allow ourselves to be triggered? When we are triggered, because sometimes you're triggered and it's not a matter of allowing it, it just happens. So when we are triggered, how do we choose to respond? Are we aware of that? And if we are, how do we choose to respond in that moment?
Very good point. Very, very good point. Now, you said something at the very beginning. You gave an example of how maybe one of your personal triggers work. So one of the things I wondered, and maybe this can help our audience, is for someone who identifies a trigger, right? Should they share that with their loved ones, or like, is it best to share it with them, or how should they share it with them? Like, so that, like, for example, in your case, you said that, if your partner gets up and leaves, then it kind of makes you feel like you've been abandoned. So to avoid that feeling for you, or for them rather, but how should that be done?
So a couple of things here. One thing I want to say is nobody else in your life is responsible for your trauma or for your trauma. Nobody else in your life currently, like, if they're not responsible for the actual trauma, they're not responsible for the fact that you have trauma, and they're not responsible for your trauma responses. So let's be very careful that we're not making them responsible for managing our trauma responses, right? That said, absolutely, we should make sure that our loved ones know. If we know that we have triggers, and we know what they are, and we know how we're going to respond to those triggers, the responsible thing for us to do is make sure that our loved ones have that information, right? Because then they know how to help us avoid those things. And the people who love us want to help us avoid those things. They don't want to trigger us. They don't want to re-traumatize us. They don't want to put us into positions where we're responding from a place of that trauma. They genuinely don't want to do that. But at the same time, we can't give them a list of rules and say, you can't do this, and you can't do this, and you can't do this, and you can't say this. Like, you have to be responsible for managing and dealing with your own trauma.
Right.
But if I'm going to my partner and saying, okay, I come from significant trauma.
Right.
One of the things I'm going to ask is, if you wake up in the morning and you run out to get breakfast, or you have an appointment that I'm not aware of, or or whatever, and I don't know that you're going to be gone when I wake up, either wake me up, please. Wake me up. You are not going to upset me by waking me up, kissing my cheek, and saying, I'm leaving, or leave a note. Like, That's my ask. Just please don't let me wake up and have you not be there. If I wake up and you're not there, like I'm far enough out of it now that if I wake up and you're not there, I'm going to send you a text and say, where are you? Is everything okay?
Right.
I'm not automatically going to go. And if I do, I'm responsible for automatically spinning into that trauma response. My partner is not
Mhm.
responsible for that. That's me.
Okay.
That's my response. Right.
Hey.
But I can make that request. I can say, hey, I know that this is my trigger. And so can you do this to help me not be triggered?
Okay.
But if they don't do that and I am triggered and I respond, that's my response and that's my responsibility. That's not theirs. I don't get to put that on them.
Great advice. I was just kind of curious the best way to do that, so that, like you said at the very beginning, we're not putting that we're remaining responsible for our trauma
Yes.
and trauma response, not responsible for the event that happened, but not making someone
Yes.
else responsible for the trauma that we experienced. So thank you for
Yes.
sharing that.
Of course.
Okay, well, we have had such an amazing talk, but we are going to take a really quick commercial break and we will be right back.
We are on an incredible journey together, sharing stories of resilience, hope, and the power of healing. To extend the reach and impact of the You Are Not Your Trauma movement, we've launched the Give 5 to Change Lives campaign. With just $5, you can contribute to developing invaluable resources like our upcoming You Are Not Your Trauma app, healing journal, and expanded podcast content. Every dollar and every share contributes to helping bring healing and hope to more people. We invite you to join this movement. Visit giving.youarenotyourtrauma.com to contribute. Together, we can change lives one heart at a time.
Okay, we are back. I just want to say to you, Faith, thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and experience with us today. Your insights into recognizing triggers and managing trauma responses has been just really invaluable. And I'm sure our listeners will benefit greatly from the information that you shared as they are navigating their own healing journeys. So it's really been an honor having you here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely to chat with you.
It's been very nice. Do you have any final thoughts to share with our listeners?
The only other thing that I would say is remember that you are responsible for your responses, but you're not responsible for your trauma.
So true. You are responsible for your responses, but you're not responsible for your trauma. That is powerful. Thank you, Faith, for sharing that. To all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of You Are Not Your Trauma podcast. Now, as we close this very enlightening discussion with Faith today, I hope that you walk away with the tools and knowledge that empower you to navigate the landscape of triggers and trauma response. Remember, understanding yourself is a lifelong journey, but the more you know, the smoother the path becomes. Understanding your triggers isn't just self-awareness, it's a blueprint for resilience. Now, if you found today's episode helpful, please share it with someone who can benefit from the information that was discussed today. Also, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the show. You can check out the website at www.youarenotyourtrauma.com to leave feedback, to request to be a guest on the show, to subscribe to the show, to get information on our show guests, or to get information about advertising on You Are Not Your Trauma podcast. You can connect with You Are Not Your Trauma podcast on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at You Are Not Your Trauma podcast. And if you have a story to share, please email me at contact@harrietmharris.com. Now, stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to explore the facets of healing, self-discovery, and empowerment. Until then, take care and remember, you are not your trauma.